to the normies, the left and the right are these cultural things with a set of policies. But a libertarian thinks the axis is 90 degrees off kilter. The true axis is towards tyranny on one side and individual liberty on the other. And I do not care which flavor of tyranny I get. I do not want it.
Human Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello and welcome to Human Nature. With me as always is Tyrone, the Porcupine hobo. How you doing, buddy?
I don't know, Foucault, how are you doing?
Forget about
Foucault, forget about it. I like that.
So today I wanted to talk about yet another of my little articles. This one is called Politics and Pendulums, or the reverse, I forget. And what inspired this one is, I'm sure you've seen it. This was a few weeks ago. There was this video going viral on social media that showed a bunch of girls at some sort of large party festival doing just dancing. It looked like country line dancing, some form of that. And I don't know, to my cynical eyes, it looked just like a bunch of girls having fun. But you'd look at the comments and the quotes on the reposts, and it was all this right-wing moralizing about, look at these slutty women and who would ever want to have anything to do with such a person, and look at the abandonment of basic human values. Would you like this as a mother or a partner? How can you take such a person seriously? And I found that a little shocking. But then I remembered my Foucault, and I assume that's how you pronounce that feller's name. And then I wasn't surprised. This is the sort of reaction you expect in politics or culture when one side feels aggrieved or that they're in the presence of some sort of insanity and they push back against it. And if you've been paying attention the last 10 years at least, you might have noticed that the left has gone insane. If you sort of understood the left as I did, starting in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, the modern left looks nothing like that. They have gone batshit on a number of dimensions. The economics is worse than it's ever been with this green agenda and climate change, which is looking more and more like a religion and less like a science. The trans insanity, the identitarian politics that's just ripping everything apart, destroying the fabric of our society, making it so we can't do anything together. It goes on and on. I have a brief list in the article of the understandable grievances you might perceive on the right by the left that would cause you to push back. And what does a pushback against extreme leftism look like? It looks like puritanical authoritarianism. It looks like the kind of national strongmanism that you might have seen in the 30s in Europe, for example. And part of my article is an admonishment to the left that if you don't want to see, you do not want to see the authoritarian pushback you'll get on the right if you keep acting like this. It will be bad. And so that was my warning. And then I closed with a little carrot or a little sugar cube I threw, to the left, because it's also perfectly clear that what caused them to move in this direction was a reaction against, the straitjacket moralism that you'd experience in the Puritan times, but even still into the 40s and 50s, where the right, from a religious perspective, was being, authoritarian and totalitarian and trying to push people around. So you can understand, as a natural and healthy lubrication to the system to prevent ossification that you get. You could understand, movement towards, the rise of feminism, equality between the races, however you define that, and freedom, and sexual orientation and this and that and the other. And it just goes to show, no matter what quote unquote side you're on, beware extremism, because you'll get a pushback that will horrify you. And I I wonder if it was ever thus, Tyrone. Are we constantly going to be swinging back and forth, or are we going to ever find equilibrium?
So great. Yeah, great points. Couple follow-up things on that. I watched the video as well, and I had the same reaction you did. I was like, "What is the big deal with
It
this?
was
Why?"
tame. It was nothing.
I mean,
It
it was
was
some
nothing.
college girls all dancing in a group, like a line dance or a predetermined sort of dance routine or something like that, and I was like, "Okay,
But
this is what we did in college all the time. What is going
buddy, when
on?"
I saw the descriptions, before you press play, and I thought I was going to watch something you'd see in the 90s or early 2000s with the Girls Gone Wild videos or something.
Yeah.
This is nothing.
No, it
What?
was nothing. I was like, "That looks like fun."
Sure.
I was like, if I was 20 years younger, I'd be like, "Let's go."
Sure.
I can't dance like that. Well, I never could, but my old knees can't take it anymore. But no, I don't know. So the fact that just things are just going to the extreme automatically on everything. Um, your point about how Democrats aren't even recognizable from what they were when you and I were sort of coming of age in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Libertarians used to have kind of a silly thing we always used to say, but we've said it for 50 years. Libertarians are the best of the left and the best of the right. It's you take the good supposed economics on the right and the good supposed liberal cultural ideas on the left. You put them together and you've got libertarianism. So libertarians were always pro gay marriage, for example. We were the first to have a woman on our she ran as a vice presidential, but on the presidential ticket. The libertarians have always been for freedom of speech and legalization of drugs and the sex industry and whatever sort of lifestyle adults want to lead, um, you know, with their own bodies and on their own property, as long as they're not harming anyone else. We don't care. We believe in freedom. That's all we want. We want people to be quote unquote their true selves, as you hear
And on the
hear,
right
hear a
side,
lot today.
on the right side, there was gun rights and fiscal
Hmm.
responsibility and,
Right.
private property and freedom of association. And I hate that formulation now,
Yeah.
because it's not principled. We're not actually, the smartest sides of the left and the right. That actually
Hmm.
doesn't mean anything. There
Right.
is an actual set of philosophical principles that define what libertarianism is, and that's not it. But in the 70s, when you're forming the Libertarian Party, back then, that actually made a little bit of sense. I mean,
Right.
if you didn't have the time to explain somebody
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
principled position, why our philosophy has these policy prescriptions flow out of it, that at least made a little bit of sense if you only
Yeah.
had 10 seconds to explain something to somebody. But now that's sure not true. What on the world is the best of the left? They've gone completely insane.
Yeah. And you're right. And I don't know where obviously the moralistic right is very tied into religion. And I don't know where religion is going in this country because you're always told in the media and things you read that religion is on the decline in the United States. That fewer and fewer people believe in God and or go to church. And yet I see more and more of these mega churches popping up everywhere,
Yeah.
everywhere. These
Yeah.
humongous monstrosities of 2,000, 3,000 people to go to a church service. I'm like, something isn't adding up to me. It I what do you think about that?
I think it was a trend that they were talking about, in the 80s and 90s. And then the trend, I mean, I mean, that's just bad science, right? You look at a trend for 15 years and then you plot 100 years in the future and then you go, oh, see, there'll be no more religion. But that's not true. There are always ebbs and flows and tidal forces moving cultural around. And if you have a right wing conservative mindset, not even a philosophy, just a predisposition emotionally, and you see the excesses of the left, that's going to drive you towards religion where you might never have even considered it if we were in more sane times. So, yeah, I don't know whether it's on the uptick or the downtick, but if it was on the uptick, it would not surprise me.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I'm getting a little nervous about both sides becoming hyper moralistic, and I don't think the left realizes that they are. You kind of mentioned that the environmental thing is turning into a religion. It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But the left has convinced themselves they have figured out what right and wrong is,
Yep.
and they're very moralistic. Now, to me, they're very dogmatic about it. They're very religious about it. So I don't know. I think the moralistic tyranny can come from the left just as quickly as it can come from the right too.
Amen. I mean, we're seeing it now. I mean, it's an old trope, or semi-old trope, but I think humans evolved with a religion-shaped hole in their heart, and if you aren't following some kind of religion, you'll fill it with an ideology. Um, we've seen it time and time again in human history, and right now the ideology is sex-based and climate change based and anti-capitalism based. Uh, Everything is racism and sexism and transphobia. And if you're just an average Joe looking for a sense of purpose and meaning, and you're an atheist, where are you going to find your sense of purpose and meaning?
Mhm.
Especially if you don't have like a job or anything, you're not good at anything. Um, People are attracted towards meaning, even when it's just some nonsense, faux meaning, like we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I think you're very right about the reaction that is happening on the quote unquote right side. You and I, being libertarians, we think the left and the right they're the exact same. I mean, you're moralistic about whatever religion, or you're moralistic about your identitarianism, whatever. The end result is the same. We're talking about tyranny, and
Yeah, just to remind viewers, you're absolutely right. To remind viewers, to the normies, the left and the right are these cultural things with a set of policies. But a libertarian thinks the axis is 90 degrees off kilter.
right.
The true axis is towards tyranny on one side and individual liberty on the other. And I do not care which flavor of tyranny I get. I do not want it.
Right. But yeah, you're seeing it. I mean, they're the the studies I've read is that Gen Z, the one following the millennials, so the generation that is just starting to get into their teenage to early 20s, are more conservative. And
Mhm.
there's lots of thoughts behind that, but one of the thinking is that the more liberal um, people of our generation, Gen X, and then the millennials, the people that were more I'll just use the term left to keep things simple, but more on the left were
Sure.
having fewer and fewer kids, and the ones on the right were having more kids, homeschooling, that type of thing. And that is starting to have a demographic shift that's about to show up in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years in this country, and it's going to be more conservative. So I think the left, your warning in your newsletter is, guys, you keep doing this crazy ass shit, look out what's coming up behind, because the reaction's going to be fierce. I'm worried about it.
Yeah, no, me too. It's interesting. I hadn't even considered the birth rate angle. I assumed it would have been some sort of a psychological response, cultural, psychological, and I'm sure both are at play to some extent. But yeah, obviously, conservatives are having more kids than liberals these days.
That's absolutely right. And they're homeschooling. They're not getting indoctrinated in public schools as much. Uh, I, a lot of my family is sort of on that side, and they limit the social media access. So these kids are growing up more conservative, traditional, whatever you want to call it, right? And when they become adults and it's their turn to run the country, I don't know what's gonna happen at that point. I do wanna pull out a quote from your newsletter, because I thought it was really good. Kind of sums a couple things up, and then kind of want to push back a little bit on something.
Bring it on, baby.
You wrote, "The left has gone nuts, and if they don't quickly do an about face, they are going to summon into existence a puritanical, religious, conservative, authoritarian, totalitarian backlash. That backlash is brewing already. It's building. You can see it clearly if you only open your eyes. You don't want to summon that demon, I promise you. And of course, this pendulum effect works both ways. part of the reason for the sexual revolution and the explosion in identitarian politics and the LGBTQI2S question mark blah blah to infinity stuff is a reaction to intolerance and bigotry, often enshrined in law on the right. So I think that kind of sums it up. Kind of what you had already said. You go back to the 50s and 60s where there were anti homosexuality laws, there were anti marriage laws that prevented interracial marriages. There were obviously discrimination for things like parks and riding on the bus and restaurants, all enshrined in law. So that was a very conservative. Again, I'll use the word conservative. I don't know if that's really right, but and the reaction in the generation that came up in the 60s, like, this is wrong. We gotta totally do an about face, flip it over. Um, and so you have this notion of the pendulum. Now, when I was in college, I've heard this theory. I mean, I think everybody's heard this theory. I heard it a slightly different way, and instead of describing it as a pendulum that just swings back and forth, uh, the way this professor proposed his theory or hypothesis was that it's more like a pendulum, but it swings in a circle. And the circle, it starts out wide, swings to the right, but then it sort of swings around. So it's making a concentric circle, a spiral, and it spirals in and spirals in and spirals in into the center. Eventually, the point was that societies and cultures eventually tend to find this middle ground, but it's not as straightforward.
That's actually kind of beautiful, and it ties into what I was just thinking. I think the back and forth pendulum model is a sign of a dysfunctional, unstable society in some respect. And if you go
Yeah,
back to our ancient myths, the mechanism for healing an ossified tyrannical structure of civilization is the hero myth, where said hero leaves the kingdom, goes out and finds some treasure from the dragon, some essential truth, some thing, some useful thing. It would be a perspective, a virtue that maybe was missing in the kingdom, brings that back, excuse me, and then heals the kingdom. And that sounds to me like the mythical form, the narrative form of that circular pendulum with an ever decreasing radius. And eventually, if we don't screw the process up, you end up with a civilization that can be at equilibrium.
So the thing I kind of wanted to push back on your article was you didn't address it. So I'm not necessarily saying you got something wrong, but I think you left something out, or you didn't explain a premise that you had in there. So if we go with this pendulum theory, the idea is that the momentum slows down. So it goes to the right and then it goes to the left, but then when it goes back to the right, it goes a little bit less to the back, and then a little bit less to the right, and then a little bit less to the left, and eventually it slows down and finds its center, and then society at that point is just sort of in a state of stable stasis where everybody's sort of made this mix of both sides. But in your article, you're actually describing the pendulum increasing in its swing. So
people are kicking it at each end, at each
you're,
end
you're,
point.
you're describing it getting bigger, going farther to the right and to the
Yeah.
left, and instead of finding the center. And you didn't explain in the article your theory behind what's causing that, because in order for that to happen, there's got to be some fuel, some energy being added to the pendulum to make it swing. And so, what's that energy? That I think that was missing from your piece.
No, you're right. And maybe the pendulum, I mean, first of all, it's an analogy, it's not
Right, of course.
But if energy is being added to the system rather than it winding down, maybe that's just a sign that you have something so chaotic it can never find a balance. Maybe the values are so diametrically opposed that these need to be two polities. Maybe they can't actually exist under the same set of rules. I hope that's not the case. When I was growing up and it seemed like all these horrible societal influences were going down, they had me singing "Free to Be You and Me" as a kid. You know,
Yeah.
I thought things were getting better. I really did, and I don't just think it's my aged, jaded cynicism that's the difference. I think we've imported a mind virus, or maybe a trolley cart full of them, and I think it can be fixed, but what's adding the energy to the system and making it go further and further apart, I can't explain it, but it has to do with these bad ideas, these irreconcilable ideas.
Yeah, so I think someone, you know, on you could I don't really know either. I have maybe two guesses, and it could be a multi-factor. All these things could be happening to add energy into the system at the same time. So one is obviously ideas. Philosophy drives the world.
Yeah.
That so when a bad idea comes along, society's going to turn in a bad direction, possibly. But I also think, I know I keep harping on this almost every episode, but I really
Money.
feel like the Federal Reserve
It's the money.
pumping in, inflating just fake money into the system, corrupting the backbone of the economic system, just has so many destructive effects, and it affects culture. It really does. It invites the moral hazard. It invites you to invest in things you wouldn't invest, to gamble with your money, to spend money you wouldn't spend otherwise, to just do bad things because I don't know.
I think you're right. I know I poo-pooed that idea on one of our episodes a little while back, but I do think you're right. And in the show notes, I'm going to underscore your claim by linking to a couple of books whose titles escape me, by Saifuddin Ammous, I think his name is. I'm sure I'm
Oh,
butchering the
yep,
pronunciation,
yep,
but he's got one. The titles are something similar to fiat money, and then the
right,
next one's like fiat everything or something like that.
yep,
And his case is exactly like yours. It's that the fakeness of our monetary system is creating a fakeness in all our systems because money touches everything, and
yep.
he makes a very strong case that I think our viewers and listeners really ought to look into. So I'll definitely put those links in the description. So yes, thank you very much for that insight, Tyrone, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please go to heymannature.substack.com for more content like this, more articles and videos. Our podcast is hosted there. And if you become a supporting listener, you will get access to other fun things, bonus segments of our interviews, bonus episodes we do, a lot of fun stuff that we're starting to cache off over there, put in the vault. And also check out my other podcast called Natural Order Podcast with Brian O'Leary. And you can talk to the show on Twitter/X at Heyman Nature, and at ReRazer, ReRazer. That's my personal account. And thank you very much, folks. We'll catch you next time.